A drive through St. Louis's Northside can tell you everything that you need to know about the current state of the gateway to the west. We start things off while heading southeast on Natural Bridge Avenue near Union Boulevard. St. Louis is a city that's full of defined small neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods that we'll be going through in this video includes the Wells Goodfellow, Kingsway West and East, the Ville, the Greater Ville, Penrose, O'Fallon, Fairgrounds, and the Hyde Park neighborhoods. Otherwise, pretty much everything that you would come across while heading up and down Natural Bridge Avenue. Alright, well, St. Louis is known for a lot of things. When most people mention the name of St. Louis, they think of the beautiful St. Louis Arch, rightfully so. It's a beautiful landmark, and it definitely deserves the recognition that it gets. St. Louis also has an abundance of rich history. You have the St. Louis Cardinals, which is a very popular baseball team, not only locally, but across the entire country. It's one of the blue bloods of the MLB. You have Anheuser-Busch and Budweiser that's headquartered in St. Louis. But with that said, the city has taken on a new identity over the last decade, and that is being the murder capital of the United States. St. Louis, just like most other major U.S. cities, has unfortunately seen its homicide rate increase drastically, specifically since 2020, and it was already pretty bad before that. Despite the increase in homicides, once the data came out for 2022, St. Louis no longer found itself in first place on the list of having the most homicides per capita. The data is measured not by the amount of homicides necessarily, because if that were the case, then Chicago would be the frontrunner by far and away. Rather, it's the homicide-to-resident ratio. Jackson, Mississippi has actually taken the reins as being America's murder capital, as Jackson saw 138 homicides in 2022, which is good for 92 out of every 100,000 residents. Jackson wasn't the only city to overtake St. Louis, as New Orleans found itself in second place with 280 murders on the year, or 74 for every 100,000 residents. Birmingham, Alabama has also passed up St. Louis, as that city saw 144 murders, or 73 for every 100,000 residents, while St. Louis is in fourth place with 200 homicides in 2022, or 68 for every 100,000 residents. Even though St. Louis doesn't find itself in the top spot on that particular list anymore after holding down number one for a stretch of 5 years or so, there's certainly not anything to celebrate over, because even though St. Louis doesn't have the highest murder rate in the country anymore, Forbes still ranks St. Louis as the most dangerous city to live in the United States in 2023. St. Louis is followed by Mobile, Birmingham, Baltimore, Memphis, and Detroit. And if you end up doing your own research for the most dangerous cities in the country, or for America's murder capitals, you'll find different publications posting different results. So if you're a St. Louis enthusiast and you don't want to believe that it's that bad here, I'm sure you can find some kind of source that will maybe have St. Louis listed as the second or third most dangerous city, rather than the most dangerous. Maybe on a different list, you'll see cities like Memphis, Baltimore, or New Orleans ahead of the great St. Louis. But whatever argument you come up with, you can't deny that St. Louis has had a serious problem with crime for a long time, unfortunately so. In St. Louis, crime has largely been a result of economic decline for the city proper, which is opposite of what we see for much of the greater St. Louis area, because if you head on out into the suburbs on the Missouri side, most of St. Louis County and St. Charles County, along with parts of other nearby counties, have been doing all right. In fact, greater St. Louis has continued to see an increase in population despite the rapid decline that we've seen in the St. Louis city limits. Here you can see that there was only one decade where the region saw a population decline, which was back in 1980. Since then, the area hasn't seen the amount of growth that it saw throughout the 50s and 60s, but it's been growth nonetheless. Now, when it comes to the city of St. Louis, there were once 856,000 people living here back in 1950, but today, St. Louis is home to only an estimated 293,000. That's a loss of 563,000 people, good for a 65.8% decline from its 1950 peak. In fact, St. Louis has lost a higher percentage of its peak population than any other major city in the country. That's right, St. Louis has had a higher percentage of decline than Detroit, a city that's been a poster child for urban decay. But not by much, as Detroit has lost 61% of its peak population. Mass population loss is a big deal for these major cities across the country because when the people leave, so do the tax dollars that are needed to keep up with not only the city services, but also the infrastructure. That's part of the reason why you see so many roads crumbling away in not only St. Louis, but in many of the country's major cities that have seen economic decline. And if things keep trending the way that they have, not only in St. Louis, but across the country, it's only going to get worse in all of the major cities. Not only have the people in the greater St. Louis area been flocking towards the suburbs, but so has the business growth over the years, as companies also want to be away from all the crime. Companies also pay slightly less taxes in the suburbs than they do in St. Louis City, as long as they stay away from Illinois and stay on the Missouri side, that is. Also, if a company has their offices out in the suburbs, then that means that the companies are located closer to where their employees live, so it's a win-win situation all the way around for companies when it comes to setting up shop in the suburbs. But don't get it confused with taxes and crime here in St. Louis because for the gateway to the West, crime is by far and away the biggest issue. We'll talk more about it later. Meanwhile, this is Fairgrounds Park, which opened as a privately owned property back in 1856. As the name of the park suggests, the site that Fairgrounds Park sits on today was originally used for several different fairs and expositions throughout the course of any given year. The St. Louis Agricultural and Mechanical Association held the St. Louis Exposition at this site from 1856 to 1902, which was a huge deal during those days. That being said, there were a few years where the exposition wasn't held during the Civil War era as the property was used for a Union encampment known as the Benton Barracks. Other amenities on the site included a small zoo, but most importantly, there was a racetrack in which horse racing would bring in thousands of spectators. The annual St. Louis Exposition stopped in 1902 in preparations for the World's Fair that was held in St. Louis in 1904. And in 1905, organized racetracks became illegal in the state of Missouri, so the property was abandoned, only to be purchased and to be used as a St. Louis City Park, in which Fairgrounds Park was then able to open on October 9th, 1909. Right across Natural Bridge Avenue from Fairgrounds Park is the old Beaumont High School, which is historically significant. Beaumont's athletic teams went by the Blue Jackets. The school opened in 1926 and it cost $1.5 million to build. In 2023, that would cost about $25.5 million. The school was named after William Beaumont, who was a St. Louis surgeon. Beaumont originally was an all-white school. However, after the Brown versus Board of Education in May of 1954, Beaumont became one of the first schools in St. Louis to desegregate. Well, from 1950 to 1970, St. Louis was seeing a massive population decline on the north side. The wealth started to move towards the suburbs as a part of white flight, and the remaining demographic on the north side was black, and among the population was an extremely high poverty rate. Usually with high poverty rates, you also see high crime rates, and that was and has been the case for the north side of St. Louis for a very long time. It's reported that during the 1990s, about 20% of the students at Beaumont were involved in gang activity. On top of that, funding for the schools in St. Louis had dropped significantly, as when people and the manufacturers moved out of town, so did the tax dollars to help fund the city services for St. Louis. Anyway, with a continuous decline in the number of students, the city could no longer justify keeping it open, and Beaumont High School closed in 2014, and it's been sitting here abandoned ever since. There are plenty notable alumni at Beaumont High School as well, including a bunch of old-timer MLB players and politicians. And to the right is another abandoned school. This is one of the buildings that Central High School has been located at over the years. Central High School claims to be the oldest high school west of the Mississippi River, as it first opened in 1853. The school has moved buildings early on due to having a lack of space, only to have a tornado significantly damage their second building. The third building that Central used was this one, in which it was used from 1927 to 2004. Today the building sits empty, as the school is now located off of Kings Highway Boulevard. But just like with nearby Beaumont High School, Central has many notable alumni, in which many of them consist of old-timer MLB players. Now that we're off of Natural Bridge, this is the Jeff-Vander-Lou neighborhood. Not many St. Louis neighborhoods have had a rougher go than Jeff-Vander-Lou. Sometimes the neighborhood will get referred to as the Yeatman area after James E. Yeatman, who was a prominent Tennessee native that relocated to St. Louis in 1842. Yeatman was a previous president of the Merchants Bank and a director of the Western Sanitary Commission during the Civil War. Back in the day, there were many industries that had a presence in Jeff-Vander-Lou, including Coca-Cola, the Brown Shoe Company, and the American Wine Company. However, today, there are only a few businesses and industries left in the neighborhood. Today, only about 3,200 people live here, and the median household income is $34,000 per year. Only 14% of adults 25 and older hold a bachelor's degree or higher, and the median value of owner-occupied housing units is $72,000, while the poverty rate is 27%. So as you can see, Jeff-Vander-Lou is a very economically depressed neighborhood. It's extremely blighted and abandoned. And as we continue throughout this video, you'll see that it's the same story for pretty much every other Northside neighborhood. Oh, and crime is absolutely out of control. Well, with that said, I'm going to take a 2-minute break. I'll be right back. We'll continue talking about the reasons why St. Louis has declined when I return. Well, back to the talking point. Some of you might be wondering if a part of the reason for St. Louis's massive decline has to do with high taxes. Well, unlike Detroit, which is another city that I've covered in depth on this channel, the taxes in St. Louis aren't really all that high when you compare it to other major cities. Any notable tax disparities for the greater St. Louis area can be seen, however, when you cross the state line, as Illinois is one of the least business-friendly states, and it has the second highest property taxes in the nation after New Jersey, whereas Missouri is actually one of the top 5 business-friendly states and has lower than average property taxes when you compare it to other states. Well, that's the biggest reason why in the greater St. Louis area we're seeing suburban growth miles away along I-70 in St. Charles County, whereas in the Metro East region, or on the Illinois side of the greater St. Louis area, we've actually been seeing a pretty steep population loss. However, there does happen to be an additional tax for the residents of St. Louis, And that tax also applies to people who work in St. Louis but live outside of the city limits. That is a 1% earnings tax that is applied. So if you happen to live in the greater St. Louis area but outside of the city of St. Louis, and you also worked outside of the city of St. Louis, then you don't have to pay that tax. But if you work inside of the city and you live outside of the city, then you get an extra 1% taken out of your paycheck, and that goes to the city of St. Louis to help pay for various city services. Anyway, with that said, it's not a huge difference, but a report by KSDK, which is the NBC affiliate for the St. Louis market, said that 75% of the earnings tax that St. Louis collects annually are actually from people who live in the suburbs and work in the city. We're now in the Greater Ville neighborhood of St. Louis. We'll talk about the demographics of the Greater Ville later. For right now, we're going to continue to talk about the decline of the city. So with that said, taxes have very little to do with St. Louis's decline and why the city has continued to decline over the years, as there have been many other issues that have played a bigger role. First, let's talk about what brought so many people to St. Louis in the first place, as St. Louis was once a large manufacturing hub and it had a huge geographical advantage as it's in the middle of the country along the Mississippi River. Railroads passed through St. Louis and connected the city with the rest of the country, making the Gateway City one of the largest railroad hubs, just like what we saw with Chicago. By 1890, St. Louis was the fourth largest city in the United States, and with St. Louis being a transportation hub, the city was able to become an industrial powerhouse and one of the largest ones in America. In fact, St. Louis at one point was the second largest auto manufacturing region after Detroit. And that's something that doesn't get mentioned much with St. Louis's history, as that kind of paints the picture as to just how big of an industrial powerhouse St. Louis was. Earlier, we passed by the site of a former auto parts factory which supplied the area's assembly plants with engine parts. That's how the auto industry used to work in this country. If a region had multiple auto assembly plants, then that would create a demand for various auto part plants. So not only could a company like Ford or General Motors build an assembly plant and employ thousands of workers in a city, but they could get their supplies from multiple other companies with nearby factories that would also employ thousands of workers. So you talk about the auto industry having a presence through hundreds of thousands of jobs. That's exactly how it used to be in these older blue-collar cities throughout the Midwest. And St. Louis used to be in second place, right after Detroit, in automotive production. These jobs didn't require a college degree. They paid well, generally speaking, and they attracted immigrants from all over the world, which is why these once industrial powerhouses grew so rapidly. Now, since manufacturing isn't as present in the United States, we're seeing these older industrial centers like St. Louis, Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. They've been declining for decades. Anyway, there were plenty of jobs throughout not only the auto industry, but through other manufacturers as well, and the abundance of manufacturing jobs made St. Louis a popular destination for black people during the Great Migration as they looked to escape the South from around 1900 to 1970. That was a huge contributor to St. Louis's population boom. That in return, however, created one of the more segregated regions that we've seen in this country. And that leads me to this, as you can't talk about the decline of the city of St. Louis without talking about race and segregation. There's an east and west street through central St. Louis called Delmar Boulevard, and sometimes it's referred to as the Delmar Divide because, historically speaking, inside of the city limits of St. Louis, north of Delmar would be where black people live, whereas south of Delmar would be where white people live. I mean, white people used to live north of Delmar before the Great Migration, but once black people moved in, white people left for newer housing in the suburbs. And during the time from the 1940s to the 70s, it was a common practice for realtors in suburban communities and other specifically white neighborhoods to not accept applications from black people. That time period was the peak of housing discrimination in this country, and it created what we see here in St. Louis today, which is an extremely segregated region. This map here shows the disparities mostly between white and black, as every blue dot represents black people, whereas every red dot represents white people. The south side of St. Louis has become more diverse in recent years, but it didn't used to be that way. However, you can also see that not only the north side of the city limits, but also some of the northern suburbs, or as locals say, North County, is mostly made up of black people. Now, to talk more about the history of racial issues in St. Louis, the city might be in the Midwest, but it definitely has its touches of Southern culture. With its geographic location, the region was split during the time of the Civil War as slave owners were more than present in the St. Louis area. At one point, historians say that slaves were once sold at the steps of the courthouse in downtown St. Louis. Before the Great Migration, it's estimated that 6% of the area's population was black. However, by 1900, there were 35,000 African Americans that lived in the city. At this time, white homeowners didn't like it, as the only city with more black people in the country was Baltimore, Maryland. European immigrants, or white people, were afraid that the new black population would not only steal their jobs, but that having black neighbors would end up lowering their home values. In 1916, St. Louis residents actually voted on an ordinance that would prevent anyone from buying a home in a neighborhood more than 75% occupied by another race. Now, that right there says everything, doesn't it? Well, today we're trying to undo the racist practices that were set by generations before us, but it's going to take a long time. Generational poverty is a real thing, and it's not easy to break out of it. If it were easy, we wouldn't have many of the issues that we still have today. But yes, that's how society was in the early 20th century. With that said, a year later in Buchanan versus Worley, the ordinance was ruled as illegal by the U.S. Supreme Court. However, the white residents still felt the way that they felt. It's well documented that there's been some residents in some of St. Louis's neighborhoods who went house to house knocking on all of their neighbors' doors, asking them to sign a legal document promising that they wouldn't sell their home to a black family. And that practice became illegal in 1948 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on Shelley versus Kramer. Even more telling is a quote from a former black St. Louis mayor, Clarence Harmon, who remembers being told in the 1960s that he couldn't move into a North County subdivision based off of the color of his skin. So, with that history pointed out, you can see how St. Louis originally became such a dramatically segregated area, and it's something that will take a long time to become undone if it ever does. So that behavior from prior generations and the fact that 100 years ago our government supported that behavior is largely to blame for how St. Louis has fallen so drastically. Now, it's not the only reason, but when you mistreat a certain demographic for multiple decades as society did towards the black community throughout much of the 20th century, this is the result that you're going to get. Black people settled on the north side of St. Louis because that's the only place that they were allowed to live, generally speaking, because if they would have applied to live in a white neighborhood or a white subdivision, they more often than not would get turned down. Not only that, but the black community on the north side of St. Louis was largely poverty-stricken from the start, as they weren't always afforded the same opportunities as whites were in the early 20th century, hence generational poverty. Once again, that's a cycle that is extremely difficult to break out of. More effects from racism during that time can be seen through the population having a low percentage of college graduates, and most of the ones who were able to break the cycle by maybe going to college or being successful in a trade left and didn't come back because most of them wanted to have a better quality of life by living in nicer neighborhoods and not being surrounded by drugs, violent crime, and poverty. That, combined with the loss of manufacturing jobs that didn't require a college degree, has helped create the environment that we see here today on the north side of St. Louis. Moving on now is by 1950 the population for the city peaked, and at this time the city was extremely crowded. St. Louis's boundaries were established back in 1876 when voters then approved separation from St. Louis County, making St. Louis the nation's first home rule city. You know, that might have worked well for St. Louis about 150 years ago, but today it's proved to be a large setback for the community. St. Louis is one of the smallest cities in area out of all of the country's major cities. Once the 1930s came around, the Great Depression caused much of the older housing in St. Louis to be neglected, and that created a demand to build newer housing in the suburbs. And with freeways connecting the city to the suburbs, and with automobiles now being used by nearly every household, people that had the means to do so started to leave the city at a rapid rate, those people being mostly white people. And they left to not only live near black people, but the newer housing was nice, attractive, and the homes had sizable yards, unlike the ones that you see here that are right up next to each other. Suburbanization was the new trend, just like it still kind of is today. Only now, we're seeing people of all demographics moving out towards the suburbs. Moving the conversation along now is, despite all of the uproar about the recent increase in crime throughout today's inner cities in the United States, what we're seeing today is nothing compared to what we saw during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, when gang violence and violent crime in the nation's inner cities throughout the country were at their peak. You can't ignore the recent spike in violent crime, however. St. Louis saw 263 homicides in 2020, which measured out to be 87 homicides for every 100,000 residents. Now, in both of the following years, the city saw that number drop quite drastically, so that's good at least, but there were still 200 homicides in both 2021 and 2022, and St. Louis continued to be one of the leaders in the country when it came to the homicide rate. Along with that, St. Louis was also one of the handful of major cities across the country that practiced in defunding the police. And after experimenting with defunding the police, I think that most of us can admit that that was a huge mistake, as that has only resulted in more violent crimes across many of our nation's inner cities, or mainly the cities that practiced in defunding the police. I mean, if you don't invest in having a good police force, and if your court system doesn't provide proper justice towards the victims of violent crime, regardless of age, gender, or race, then you're just enabling toxic and criminal behavior, and you're not going to make any of these communities better that have faced high rates of violent crime for many years. In fact, it's going to do the opposite of what most residents want, as it's going to make them that much more dangerous. I mean, how many times have you seen stories in the news recently across the country of kids walking to school in these inner cities only to become victims of violent crime? It's terrible and sad to see, quite honestly. Take a look at Detroit, Michigan, for example, which, by the way, is 80% black, and the Detroit area has seen much of the same issues with segregation that we see in the greater St. Louis area. Anyway, Detroit is a city that has faced extremely high rates of violent crime, as most of us know, for many decades now. Most of us remember seeing Detroit at the top of lists for being the most dangerous city, year after year, decade after decade. However, recently, we've slowly started to see things get better in Detroit. There's still a lot of work to be done in that city, but things are pointing in the right direction at least. For example, instead of defunding the police, Detroit actually increased the budget for their police department, and as a result of that effort, we've seen 5 cities overtake Detroit as being the most dangerous in the country. This stretch of Dr. Martin Luther King Drive serves as the border for both the Ville and Greater Ville neighborhoods, in which both neighborhoods today have low median home values, along with high poverty rates among the remaining residents. Just under 1,500 people live in the Ville, whereas just over 4,000 live in the Greater Ville. You can see that the median household income is slightly higher in the Greater Ville than in the Ville, and the rest of the stats between the two neighborhoods largely mimic that. Regardless, neither neighborhood is in good condition today, and it's sad to see because when you look around at many of the remaining homes, you can tell that the structures were built well. And it's just nice to see a collection of older architecture featuring brick homes when you compare it to what today's modern construction looks like. There are many other reasons as to why St. Louis has declined and has continued to decline over the years, but it can mostly be summed up to issues with extremely high rates of crime in the forms of gang and drug activity, which is partially the result of extremely high rates of poverty among the residents who have lived on St. Louis's Northside for decades now. And it all started with the segregation practices from prior generations throughout much of the 20th century. Once the majority of people started to leave the city limits of St. Louis to go live in the suburbs, it's all been a downward spiral, and It would be tough for any city to try to get out of this slump. Just go ask Detroit how much fun they've had trying to solve issues there. Also, something that I haven't talked about in this video is the corruption that's gone on among St. Louis quote-unquote leaders over the years, as that also plays a huge role into how the city has been unable to turn things around. In fact, as recently as December of 2022, there were 3 former St. Louis aldermen that were sentenced to prison for corruption. Now, in order for St. Louis to have a chance at being able to turn things around, there's multiple ways that the issue could be addressed. If the city could ever get the violent crime rate under control, then that would be huge, and in my opinion, that's where it should start. People around the greater St. Louis area would notice the lower crime rates, for example, in St. Louis, and they would be less afraid to spend time in the city. Maybe a businessman would be more likely to invest greatly in the downtown area, and it could eventually attract young professionals to move in. For example, since 2010, only 2 buildings have been built over 300 feet tall in the city limits of St. Louis, which helps illustrate the sluggish economic growth for the city proper over the years. Whenever the time comes that the city is able to find some positive momentum, St. Louis will need to find a way to keep that going. We'll just have to wait and see if that date will come. And it's definitely possible. Nothing is impossible. The greater St. Louis area has plenty of economic activity, unlike other areas maybe like Memphis or New Orleans. The problem, however, is that all of the economic activity, or all of the money, is just found in the suburbs, on the Missouri side of the region. Also, it goes without saying that it comes down to the individuals. You know, if you're a parent, look yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, are you doing the best job that you can be doing as a mother or a father to provide your kid with the best possible environment in order to help them succeed? And if you're a kid, are you doing everything that you can to put yourself in a position to succeed in life? And it starts with school. I get that it's easier said than done in a lot of situations, as drugs, unfortunately, are extremely common in the inner cities, let alone St. Louis, and gang culture has a huge presence in many of the neighborhoods. So much so that it's almost impossible to ignore gang culture if you grow up here. But the truth is that life isn't fair. You don't get to choose if you're born into a great situation or a bad situation, but you do have the option to turn that around. Granted, it's not easy to do so, which is why the issues that we've seen have continued to linger on for so long. Anyway, it's not the situation that defines you, rather it's all about what you do with your situation that defines who you are, and everyone has the freedom in this country to make their own decisions. If you're someone that has or is currently growing up in the north side of St. Louis, and you've watched this video to this point, do your best to make good life decisions. Everyone makes mistakes and it's okay to do so, but the unfortunate truth is that the room for error is less for some people rather than for someone who maybe was born into a family that has generational wealth. But anyway, do it for yourself and do it for your future family tree if you're someone who wants to raise your own family one day. Do whatever it takes to succeed in school and to set yourself on the right track. Maybe one day after heading down the right path, you could be fortunate enough to be able to give back to the community that you grew up in, and you could be that inspiration for others, just like many others have been able to do who grew up in these neighborhoods. Well, I continued my drive on St. Louis's north side for another 30 minutes or so, and to see a video of everything else that I saw while driving on St. Louis's north side on this fine fall day of 2021, make sure to subscribe to my second channel, and the link for that is down below. And once part 2 of this video is uploaded on my second channel, the link for part 2 will also be down below. With that said, I do end the video here. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to drop a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, as doing all of those things helps these videos destroy the evil monster that is the YouTube algorithm. Also make sure to hit that notification bell so that you can be notified every time that I upload a new video. If you enjoyed this video, then you might enjoy checking out some of the featured playlists on this channel. Videos with amazing insights on other places like what you saw here can be found in my St. Louis playlist, my American Hoods playlist, or in my Missouri playlist. Last but not least, if you can't get enough of me on here, you can always go follow me on my other social media accounts, and those links are below. We'll see you next time. Peace.